Hi, David. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Eric.
Good. So, for the podcast listeners, you are... Please identify yourself.
I am David Ignatius. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. I'm also a novelist, and I've written 6 novels. I also am, like you, a kind of Middle East junkie, although I'm not like you, just coming back from having lived in Syria. But it's part of the world.
We were going to save that as
from.
Like a, it's a special treat.
I just can't. I can't restrain myself.
Yeah. Okay, so now my turn to identify myself. I feel like we're doing icebreakers right now. My name's Eric Umansky, and I did just get back from Syria for 6 months. What do I do? I write some. I'm now a contributing editor for CJR, and I write freelance in various places and have a website. That's my identification. So, given that we're both Mideast junkies, we should probably talk about something first that, as it happens, isn't really in the Mideast, but it's kind of close. So I think it qualifies. And that is the elections in Pakistan. Now, just to sort of set the frame here, neither you and I are experts about this, right? We set that stage right there.
I can only speak for myself, and I am so far from being an expert. It will become apparent, I fear. But it's a place I follow, but I've spent very little time in over the years.
Okay, so I've spent no time in it over the years, and a place I moderately follow. So, with that caveat, what do you think of the elections?
I think the repudiation of Musharraf tells us, to be honest, that Pakistan is heading in a better direction. Musharraf came in really trying to stabilize a country that had a very corrupt president, prime minister. He represented the army, which was a national force, and he tried to bring Pakistan together under the army's ethos. And the problem is that he politicized the army, and Pakistanis saw it. One thing that I was struck by when I was there, Eric, a few weeks ago, is Pakistanis really do love their army as a symbol of this country, symbol of all the diverse regions that don't fit quite together. And the army symbolizes this aspiration for unity. And Musharraf was seen as having taken a professional army and politicized it, made it his instrument, the instrument of his party, of his people. And the new chief of staff, whose offices I visited, I didn't have a chance to talk to him, but was there talking to people who were meeting with him, is a different cat. He's a person who's determined to make the army a real professional army once again. He ordered his generals to stop talking to Musharraf or any other politician, and said, you're soldiers. You don't consort with politicians. He pulled back retired army officers who'd gone to work in all these cushy jobs in the civilian ministries. So I think that general distaste for what Musharraf had done became clear to us in these election results. I got to say the numbers were even larger than even anti-Musharraf people had predicted.
Yeah. Well, the other aspect of it, right, is the U.S.'s role in supporting Musharraf over the years. Because if I were to, my take on it is I think the U.S. has, frankly, royally screwed it up over the years with its support, near blind support of Musharraf. And I think it's another instance to me of support for a strongman coming back and at least beginning now, or having the possibility of biting us in the tush. I'm curious if you have a different take on that.
My tush isn't hurting. I don't feel as if the U.S. got bitten in these elections yesterday. But it has the
possibility of that, doesn't it?
It does.
You have a sort of resentment about the U.S. support of Musharraf.
Pakistanis are very proud, like most people around the world, and they want their country to be theirs. This idea that we were blindly supporting Musharraf, I think, overlooks the fact that through last year we were increasingly desperately trying to broker a deal between Musharraf and Benazir Bhutto for a power-sharing arrangement. The idea that she would become prime minister, Musharraf would give up his role as chief of staff and become president, of a symbolic figurehead president, and that was the aim, precisely because we were nervous that Musharraf was getting more and more unpopular, and we were pitched totally to him.
Yeah, well, correct me if I'm wrong here. My understanding of that deal, of pushing for that deal, was that that it did go on, but that it wasn't exactly it wasn't particularly sort of supportive of a democratic process. It was a backroom deal, and that the U.S. was pushing for it. Pushing for this power sharing arrangement with Bhutto, but that also would have pushed away from power the various reformists who had like the Lawyers Association and so forth. So that this was it was like kind of a backroom deal where the U.S. was realizing was changing its bet on horses, but the notion of that you should be betting on a specific horse and pushing a specific horse, that wasn't questioned. You see where I'm going with that?
I do. I share this view that trying to tinker with a country like Pakistan that we know so little about is a loser. I found myself thinking as this crisis was developing in the fall, Musharraf really is another Shah of Iran in the sense that he's a very pro-American, military-backed leader in a very unstable part of the world. The consequences of his being overthrown, quite frankly, could really be scary for us. We shouldn't forget that there are a lot of people operating in Pakistan who want to kill us. They want to kill you and me. They want to take down our cities. They'd kill 1 million of us tomorrow if they could. And Musharraf and the army that to a greater or lesser extent back him are one of the things that's keeping that absolute disaster from happening. As somebody who was, just think back to Iran. There was a lot of enthusiasm, sort of the social engineering kind from Washington about getting rid of the Shah. The Shah was retrograde, and the Iranian people didn't like him, and a lot of people think we connived in his ouster. You have to look at what happened and the consequences. We're still living with them every day. It changed the Middle East totally. And so the lesson for me is, don't go down roads, blithely thinking you know what's at the other end. You don't.
Right, but they could go the other way, right? I mean, the support of the Shah. One of the things there is there was a pressure cooker situation, right? In other words, you had support of the Shah over years and years and years, where they disallowed dissent, and that therefore you had this kind of complete break, but and you have somebody like Khomeini take over. But one thing that struck me is interesting with the Pakistan thing, and I don't actually know how this turned out with election results, but I saw a piece in the Times just a few days ago that was some polling from Pakistan, and it pointed out that the religious parties had a tiny amount of support, in the low single digits. And I don't know if you noticed the same thing, but it struck me as, this is what Musharraf has been sort of pushing for years, and supporters, or sort of nominal supporters of him, have been pushing, is this notion of, this notion of be careful what you wish for, and the possibility that you could have essentially religious fanatics take over. And, I don't know about the possibility of it, but that poll seemed to suggest to me that there's a kind of boogeyman aspect to all of that.
I don't think the idea that Islamic insurgents in Pakistan are a boogeyman, I don't buy. I think they're not tremendously popular. I think in the Islamic world generally, as I travel, I don't find people becoming in large numbers more fanatic. I think they're frightened by the disorder they see around them. I think, like people everywhere in every slice of the modern world, they're searching for meaning and identity, and so they turn to religion, much as people do in the United States. I don't think it's all that different. And I think in Pakistan it is true that the religious parties, some of which were really grotesque tools that were created by Musharraf, pretend, make-believe religious parties, have declined in popularity. But that doesn't mean that there are not a small group of people who are out there who want to get us. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two.
I agree with that. The question to me is there are clearly people who have a sort of jihadist mindset and have a kind of international jihadist mindset that want to go on the long war, whatever you want to call it. But the question is, to the degree that threat has been played up, and in particular for this sort of specific instance of in order for Musharraf to frankly shore up his support, perhaps less so now than it was in previous years, but for him to shore up his support among in Washington. So that kind of dynamic.
He played the jihadist card, you could argue, but then it's a pretty powerful card whether he played it or not. I think that the point that I would make, Eric, is that Pakistanis, like people everywhere, are going to have to write their own history. And the judgment we should make is that people are rational. I think that the idea that the Muslim world or any other part of the world is fundamentally irrational, that people won't act in their own interests is wrong. And that we need to act in our interests. We have some very powerful interests. I mean, we have cities at risk. We have a large population that needs to be protected. So we have to be sensible about that. But the idea that we can steer this and tinker with it, and as you said, make a backroom deal and install Benazir for this, I just think the time for that really ought to have passed. It doesn't work. It makes people angry when it does work. Viz the Shah in Iran. So enough already.
Yeah. But I don't know if you saw this, but this is a slight segue in your paper in the Post today on page 1. There was this piece about this killing of I forget his first name, but al-Libi.
Yes.
And did you the fascinating thing about that piece was that it wasn't done, at least according to the report, that it wasn't done in coordination with the government. With the Pakistani.
No, we informed them. This was describing how predator drones over the federally administered territories where Bin Laden and company hang out had fired a Hellfire missile assassinating this Al Qaeda figure, al-Libi, and our story said that the Pakistanis give permission for the predators to be based on their territory, and the predators can take off without getting any special okay, and they were informed of this operation, but that's not the same, obviously, as approving it.
My understanding is they were informed, once it was ongoing, that they weren't given a sort of advance heads up. But
yes, no, I think that was my reading of the piece too.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the Pakistanis don't seem to have squawked much about this, which I guess goes to show that if you actually hit the target, you get less flack than if you don't.
Yeah. It was also interesting that there was this reference in the piece to it was the first successful hit in X number of years, a couple of years or something like that in the area. Am I recollecting that correctly?
It did say that. I have to note that I never am sure I believe statements like that, because there could be very powerful reasons why you wouldn't talk about a success somewhere. I mean, you just never know. About this kind of thing, I've grown weary of information.
Yeah. Well, then of course there's the other targeted assassination, should we call it, of our Imad. What is it? Imad? I always forget
Imad
his first name.
Mughniyah. Yes.
Mughniyah. I have to practice my ghaz.
Well, you're the expert now.
Yeah. That's what my Arabic teacher told me at one point when I first began learning it, that this letter, gha, he said, make like you're throwing up. That was his tip on that one. So anyway, that's of course our segue for the assassination portion of the discussion. And you were telling me earlier that you were, in Lebanon when in '83 for the Beirut barrack bombings, that Mughniyah is, was reportedly behind in some way or another?
This man's death had a special impact for me because on that day, I think it was April 17, 1983, that the U.S. Embassy in Beirut was hit by the truck bomb that he had sent. I was in the embassy. I left about a half hour before the bomb arrived. I was in the embassy, hauntingly for me, seeing a U.S. Army colonel who was telling me all about how our military assistance program was going to put the Lebanese army back together and unite Shiites and Sunnis and Christians, and it was rhetoric so hauntingly like what you hear from Iraq. Anyway, I left the embassy, climbed back up the hill to the Commodore Hotel, boom! Loudest explosion I'd ever heard in Beirut. Went running back to the Corniche and saw the skin of the embassy blown away. Just a terrible, terrible scene. To me, Eric, that's the day in which this war of terrorism, if you can use that phrase, began. It was, we now know, a very deliberate, targeted attack by Iran using cutouts, using Imad Mughniyah, a very skilled operative. It was followed by the attack on our Marine barracks, again done covertly by the Iranians. The Iranians proceeded to shut down Beirut, a city that I love to this day, by kidnapping Westerners off the streets to the point that it was a no-go zone. But this was orchestrated by Mughniyah, as clever and you could argue as diabolical an operative as ever came out of that world. And the way in which he was assassinated himself by a car bomb in Damascus has got every Mideast junkie gossiping, speculating. Did the Syrians connive in it? Did they do it? Why would they do it? What will the Iranians do to the Syrians? It's just it's a wonderful Mideast stew right now.
What do you have any particular leading theories or favorite theories on that one?
I've read the speculation. It strikes me as plausible, but then conspiracy thinking in that part of the world always seems plausible because there's so many potential conspirators. The argument is that that Mughniyah and this secret Hezbollah connected underground in Lebanon may have been connected in some way with the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, the Lebanese prime minister, and that the Syrians, knowing that the trial was coming, that the showdown was coming,
a job, a Mr. Wolf or whatever.
This is in Pulp Fiction. This is yes. Mr. Wolf shows up and kind of grimly scrubs down the furniture. That's the argument. There's been speculation for so long in Lebanon about a Hezbollah connection to the Hariri killing, without any firm evidence that I'm aware of. That I just note this, that it's speculation, that the people who are pushing it have some very powerful reasons for doing so. It does seem a little bit hard to imagine that in Damascus, which is a pretty locked down city, you could get into the most feared terrorist in the world's Pajero SUV, put a bomb behind his steering wheel, I think is where it's supposed to have been, and then Bluey in a very populated part of town. But then people get killed every day in that part of the world. So what do you know?
I sort of lean just towards Occam's razor, just because it is the most likely option of Israel. But I have no evidence. I will say that that neighborhood, that popular part of town, is. That I went to a very fine mall there. They have a new mall in Damascus that is it's like being in Orange County suddenly, and it is, I believe, blocks away from where Mughniyah was killed. But one of the things
Eric? I want to think of you as a mall rat in Damascus. I'm trying to get this picture of you kind of getting a latte and chilling at the Virgin Records megastore. Is that what?
I'll tell you what happened. This is sort of a little side story. So we were. This is my fiance and I had been in Damascus for a couple of weeks and were sweating our asses off. And it was in July. It was 115, and we were still going around buying essentials because we were having to buy bed sheets and et cetera, et cetera. So somebody recommended this mall, and we walked in, and it was like, there was like an aura around the mall, and there were palm trees inside of it, and it was air conditioned, and there were escalators, by the way, that people would sort of be freaked out to get on them, because if you've never been on an escalator before, and there are very few in Damascus, or in Syria for that matter, it's like not an easy thing to walk on it. So the whole thing had this air of being very foreign, and it was, and we then went into a supermarket where, it was like basically being in Whole Foods. It was just row after row of items, and we were in there, and then the power dropped out. Massive power outage, air conditioning goes off, lights go out, you're in the basement.
It's welcome to the future. We're just working out a few technical details.
Yeah, basically. And so, we had this like Orange County experience for about 20 minutes, and then we're back to sweating and
The sad thing about that, I mean, it's wonderful that Syria is jumping in the future and has a really cool mall. Syria is it's a sort of wicked pleasure for a foreign correspondent like me, a foreign traveler, in that it's a place that still is exotic, feels different. If you go to Aleppo in the north, to the markets there, if you go to neighborhoods in Damascus, and you do have a sense that Syria, before in the blink of an eye, will become part of McWorld. That this amazing process that's taking every city in the world and making it feel a little bit like all the other cities is going to hit Syria like sitting everywhere else. I was just in Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, and I had that same feeling. I thought, God, this is the most exotic place I've ever been. You know what? It looks like most other places. I shouldn't say that, but it looks too much like other places.
Yeah, we the neighborhood that we moved into and eventually got an apartment in was essentially what I referred to as the Chelsea, as in New York Chelsea of Damascus, where there was a Starbucks knockoff, and there was it was like a cruising neighborhood, and cruising for both genders, and it was. At one point, we're walking through the neighborhood, and yes, you have this feeling of, geez, I'm in exotic, I'm in exotic Damascus. And all of a sudden, this truck comes rumbling by that has nothing in the back of it except for one of those massive ads. It's like an ad truck, and inside the sort of plastic of the ad is a big hamburger. And it's an ad for some hamburger joint in Damascus, and all it's doing is cruising around the neighborhood, enticing people to go to the hamburger joint. So
this is progress. This is what we yearn for.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is, I actually found it to be, it was fun in its own sense, but.
One thing just because I go to Syria often that I think people don't appreciate is that Syria, like a lot of places in the Islamic world in the Middle East that give us so much trouble, has a yearning for the modern world that is so powerful. I mean, whether people are Islamic in their beliefs and dress. They are just racing into this future. Whenever I watch Arab TV and see the call-in shows and people calling in for their favorite music, it's amazing. I was on Google Earth yesterday looking at remote parts of Iran because of a novel I'm writing. It's set in various places. If you want to describe where your characters are going, you literally look at it street by street. So I'm out in Mashhad, and there's a feature, sort of wiki feature with Google Earth where you can identify your house and all over Mashhad, in the remote eastern stretches of Iran, people have marked their houses. This is where I grew up. This is my uncle's house. And it was spooky, I'll tell you, just this sense of how technology is making the world a different experience for people.
You got, when I was in Damascus, one of the amazing things was, of course everybody had a cell phone, from the garbage man to whomever. Everybody had a cell phone. And by the way, cell phones were only legalized there about 5 years ago or something like that. So, you have this massive change. But also, people skirt whatever laws there might be to limit connections abroad, right? So there was, I don't know if you heard that Facebook was blocked back in the fall in Syria, and I first heard about it when I was in an internet cafe, and 10 minutes later a guy says to me, "Hey, you want to get back on Facebook?" And gives me the URL for a proxy, and we're back on Facebook. The Syrian government had also banned, while we were there, which actually shortly before we had arrived, had tried to ban Skype. Every internet cafe you go into, and there's an internet cafe every block and a half basically now, you walk in there and there aren't really Skype headsets very obviously, and you say, "I'd like to use Skype," and they say, "Oh, no problem." And they bring out the Skype headset that is beneath every computer, basically, at an internet cafe in Damascus. Which is why, and this is now a segue back to U.S. foreign policy, which is why I think the notion of not engaging is to shoot ourselves in the foot. That might be a bad segue, but I actually think that that's true. if you're familiar with the work of a friend of mine, Andrew Tabler, who's he's an American journalist who's lived in Syria for a number of years.
Don't know.
And, yeah, well, his shtick basically is that Syrians are ultimately, because of, they've always been at this sort of crossroads in the Middle East, that they're merchants, and that that the way to engage them is ultimately with business, and that the sanctions that the U.S. has are effectively counterproductive in the end. That they're cutting off connections that we could have with Syria, and influence ultimately that we could have with Syria. After spending time there, and by the way, having my Schwab account frozen after I tried to access it from Syria, but just seeing various effects, and how significant the Iranian influence is in terms of the economy, it strikes me as a compelling argument that it's just we're limiting our own influence by doing those kind of things.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the great lessons of the time that I've been alive is that openness breaks down borders, breaks down authoritarian governments, breaks down governments' ability to control their populations.
Yeah.
That once the door is open, it starts a process of change that really can't be controlled. It's astounding to me when I look back at how quickly the Soviet Union, this behemoth that had terrified people, in my generation. I grew up really worrying every night about nuclear war. This behemoth just imploded, collapsed within a decade. Mm-hmm. It was gone, and it really was this pervasive communication and connection. There's that wonderful E.M. Forster line we all love to quote from Howard Zinn, "Only connect." And I think that there is something to that. There are problems in the world that defy that. When you think about Iran, when you think about how hard that regime works to keep people who are hungry for the future, hungry to connect, hungry to be part of our world, from really doing so fully. When you think about the malign influence, to my judgment, that Syria exerts, certainly in Lebanon and that part of the world, to preserve what the regime sees as its prerogatives, that just being open, just connecting, isn't going to get the job done. But I do think these places change quickly as they open up, and usually change in good ways.
Yeah. Which we could actually talk about the other news of the day, which I find about the least shocking news, banner headline that could be, which is now Castro, quote unquote, stepping down in Cuba, and then what the U.S.'s policy should be now on. I mean, I don't know if I think I just saw before we went on that Obama basically said, screw whatever pandering, we need to engage ultimately with Cuba, which strikes me as
Good for him. He must be
yeah.
convinced that he's going to win. That he's going to win Florida already.
Or he's convinced he's going to lose.
Well,
one way or the other.
Florida, Cuba is a case in point of what we're discussing. I mean, when I think about this long, bizarre history, 47 years of isolation, conflict, near nuclear war. It does seem to me that if we had not tried to embargo Castro and his socialism, but let the breeze flow in, Cuba would have flipped years ago, decades ago. It's inconceivable that it could have remained this isolated Marxist outpost in a world that was changing. It just wouldn't have happened. Castro was a charismatic man. Castro came to stand for the idea that you can defy the big guy, but poke a stick in the big guy's eye, which, let's face it, little guys around the world have always liked. But it wouldn't have lasted if we hadn't. I mean, this is to appease a very powerful political lobby in the United States. We adopted policies that had the exact opposite consequence of what those lobbies claimed that they wanted to do. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I actually think, there's a similar thing in Syria to in Cuba, and it's the same, I assume, in most parts of the world, right? You have a strong man. One way that they keep their power and justify their power is to point to an external enemy, right? And so Syria has its emergency laws where they can point to, this purported threat from Israel and from the U.S. And Cuba gets to, Castro gets to point out to the great Yankees, to the north.
It has been noted that emergency laws and really scary external enemies have been used politically, even here in the United States. I know that's shocking to you. Right?
I don't know what you're talking about.
You've been away for so long, you probably don't realize that could happen here.
Yeah. When I was now I'm gonna name drop another trip that I went on. I don't know if you can name drop trips, but I'm doing it. So a few years ago, I was actually in Cuba, hanging out. And I was talking to some dissidents there, and there was a universal feeling of forget about scorn for Castro, which there really was, held very strongly by dissidents I was speaking to, who then basically said that the U.S. should stop screwing around. I mean, should stop basically meddling in Cuba, and that it ultimately is again a counterproductive move. And so, this distinction between kind of meddling and versus, and it gets even back to Pakistan, but versus a more kind of hands-off approach where you're not picking a horse, and you're not trying to subvert ultimately in one way or another people's will.
Well,
maybe that's a stretch, but
no, I don't think it's a stretch. I mean, there's a difference between protecting your interests, which I think you do have to do. You have to be pretty hard-headed about, and trying to meddle gratuitously in other people's affairs. I mean, there is this sort of American notion that we're the city on the hill. Everybody should be like us. We do it right. Democracy and freedom are God-given, inalienable rights, and if they're being suppressed, it's our responsibility to jump in. And that, when you think about the change of administration, certainly this would be the case with Obama, but I think you could argue it with any of the three likely candidates, even McCain. We are going to turn that page, I think. I mean, I think this extreme moralism and interventionism, this sort of armed Wilsonian thing that was going on with the Bush administration, I don't see that in John McCain. I think John McCain really wants to win in Iraq, but I think he is a much less lump in the throat, city on the hill kind of guy. And I think it's good that as a country we really re-examine that and think we have to, politicians in the military have to stop writing checks that the country isn't prepared to cash, which is what we do again and again. I mean, we're in the process of doing it now in Africa, I worry. Where we have such a huge... Well, we have... In the military, without anybody realizing, has created something called AFRICOM, the Africa Command. Mm-hmm. It is gearing up. If they get their forward headquarters built in Africa, it's going to be a $5 billion investment. We have a very talented general, General Kip Ward, who's the commander of AFRICOM. And the implicit idea is that AFRICOM's humanitarian problems, its ability to hold together, resist tribalism, is a national security issue for the United States. So our military needs to be there, digging wells and vaccinating people, and because we have a national security interest. And but here I'm back, and you're back.
Okay, we can continue. We're back. These guys can do the editing.
They can do the editing. So yeah.
So you were talking about AFCOM and the notion of a kind of hubris ultimately is what you're talking about, right?
Well, armed humanitarianism. You can argue. In fact, I would argue that at bottom a big part of Iraq was the idea of going in to get rid of the worst of these tyrants. And there were human rights issues in Iraq that were monstrous. So it was you could argue there was an armed humanitarian component to it. We all think, gosh, Iraq was such a terrible mistake. This malign intervention's got to stop. But as soon as a benign intervention comes up, I found that liberals were almost demanding that the United States intervene in Pakistan, Darfur, yes, but in Pakistan in support of Benazir Bhutto, this wonderful feminist beacon of democracy. Really? Yeah, there were a lot of people who were saying we need to do more to get Musharraf. They were saying we need to get Musharraf out. That it's our job to rejigger that society so the good guy, the good woman wins. And because people haven't been looking at it, I would note that we should pay attention to Africa and AFRICOM Does Africa command where this question is being debated and discussed anew, but with almost no public input?
Because I actually have a different perspective on that, which is that I'm actually afraid of a sort of realist point of view, the kind of realist paradigm taking over again. Because I'm actually, and this is puts me, I believe, in the kind of mushy idealist category. But I find the notion of democracy promotion, which is not to say in a kind of in a wide sense, that is promoting the institutions toward democracy and responsive government. But I find the notion of that to be quite compelling, and I actually find it to be compelling from ultimately a national security perspective. That it makes the U.S. to the degree that you help encourage responsive and accountable governments, it's going to help the U.S. in the long run. Now you have to separate that, in my view, then from the Bush administration's rhetoric around it, but also this is this sort of aggressive interventionist side of that. And I don't think that it needs to be it doesn't even need to be. You can separate all that out from even the very kind of liberal interventionist, Samantha Power's perspective, in terms of intervening in Darfur or whatever. But simply this notion of a belief in the power, not for moral purposes, but for our own purposes largely, of encouraging accountable governments. And I think that I actually fear to the degree that we're going to lose that idea. And weirdly, it puts me in occasionally agreeing with the administration, at least with the administration's rhetoric.
I think I would be more in the realist camp than you, Eric. I think that the overriding thing is not to make promises to people we can't keep. Through my life as a foreign correspondent, writer about foreign affairs, I've seen again and again us go into countries and make promises to people overtly or covertly, and then when the going got tough, cut and run, bail out, just leave them hanging, and leave the people who most depended on us most vulnerable.
You're talking about like the Kurds?
I saw that. I saw that in Lebanon in the early '80s. I mean, you could argue that, we did that in Central America. We armed a resistance and then tried to bail out of it. It's just basically our MO, and the reason is that we are not a patient and disciplined people in that regard. We're not very good imperialists, for better or worse. We don't stay a long course. So I think we have to be really careful about it. That's one thing. The second thing I think is that we really need to shut up and listen for a while. We have such a big megaphone. And I'll give you an example. My family is Armenian American. My grandfather was born in the Ottoman Empire, so I feel very strongly about these histories of the genocide of the Armenians. But when the House was going to pass a resolution, sort of denouncing Turkey and telling the Turks what to do, although I thought every line of the resolution was true, in a sense I understood why that was going to backfire, because people are sick of being told what to do and what to think by the United States, even when we're operating for the best of motives. So, I think in this period when we turn a page, have a new administration, a big part of strategic communications ought to be not talking louder or better, but listening.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I just have this sense that the U.S. intervenes in various ways, right? And militarily and economically and whatever it is, and it influences simply. I mean, you don't need to put a bad adjective to it, but that this notion, maybe actually we're not that far apart. I just think that this notion of pushing, for trying to think of the best way to put this, but that that if we encourage institutions as opposed to encourage specific players, or support institutions as opposed to specific players, and here I think we likely don't disagree, but that if we do that, it's going to be in our best interest in the long run.
Well, we should be clear about what our values are whenever people ask us. When we have interests at stake, we need to be ready to defend them. I'm just struck that the words that have meaning for us increasingly, I find, don't have a lot around the world. I mean, we talk so much about democracy, and we have our own metrics for what that is, and increasingly I find I wish that we were talking about the rule of law, about accountability. I mean, I don't know what governments can do. I don't work in government, but I'm a journalist, and what you and I can do is to be part of our community of journalists and hold our colleagues accountable. Say, that was a great piece. That took a lot of guts. The thing you did from Damascus was really balls out. It was fabulous. And let them hold us accountable. If somebody says, David, you really ducked it. You really didn't hit that as hard as you need to. And, your colleague overseas, am going to hold you accountable. I think that those communities of interest, having nothing to do with government, having nothing to do with a nominal agenda, I think are really making a difference. I'm more and more struck by that. That the NGO ties, in some ways, are more powerful agents for change than the government ones.
Right, and blogging heads, of course, is a powerful agent for discussion and for change.
Amen.
I'm looking for a wrap up here.
It is. I shudder. I shudder to think of all the change we're going to encourage by our conversation, Eric. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Good to speak with you. And thanks for doing this with me.
Enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.